the Bhopal Lit Fest. It's also the day when we invite our audience for a treasure hunt, solve a mystery, and win some prizes. Stay tuned to know more. And also, don't miss the exhibitions that are going on. Modern Art Gallery has the exhibition of Padma Shri artist Bhuri Baiji, and there is a tribal art fair at Adirang, which is hosting Gond and Beg Artists Camp and Exhibition. We begin the second day of the Lit Fest with a session on Bharat Before the British, for which I would like to invite Ms. Shonaleeka Kaul and Dr. Rima Hooja on the stage. And ladies and gentlemen, we also begin the day too with a book launch. Right. I would also like to invite Mr. N.S. Bafna and Mr. Rishi Shukla on the stage to launch Professor Kaul's book, Bharat Before the British and Other Essays Towards a New Indology. With great delight, we announce the launch of Bharat Before the British and Other Essays, written by Professor Shonaleeka Kaul. Since the Central India launch of Professor Kaul's book, Bharat Before the British and Other Essays Towards a New Indology is a magisterial new history of early India and her regions. Masterfully bringing together literature, philosophy, anthropology, and art, this outstanding collection of 17 essays challenge a whole range of colonial misconceptions about our country and invites us to rethink our understanding of India and Indology in a way that does justice to our land and its rich traditions. The book is authored by Professor Shonaleeka Kaul, who explores a number of fundamental questions regarding the history of early India and offers clear cut answers to them in her book. And we shall get a glimpse of that in her session today with Dr. Rima Hooja. Professor Kaul is India's leading cultural historian specializing in Sanskrit literature. She's a professor of Center for Historical Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University and has also been the Malati Singh Distinguished Lecturer in South Asian Studies, Yale University, Jon Gonda Fellow in Indology, Leiden University, and visiting professor at South Asia Institute, Heidelberg University. A prolific author, she's published 9 internationally acclaimed books, each demolishing colonial fallacies about India and putting up understanding of it. Some of her books include Imagining the Urban, Sanskrit and the City in Early India, The Making of Early Kashmir, Landscape and Identity in Rajatarangini, Myths and Palaces, New Perspectives in Indian Cultural Geography, and Bharat Before the British and Other Essays Towards a New Indology. She's been invited to speak widely around India and the world, including at Paris, Rome, Stanford and Michigan, Berlin, Johannesburg, World Sanskrit Conference at Bangkok and Canberra, and the United Nations. She'll be in conversation with Dr. Rima Hooja, an archaeologist, historian, and writer. Dr. Hooja has a PhD from Cambridge University. She's currently the director of the Maharaja Savai Man Singh II Museum, Jaipur, Director Jaigarh Fort, Trustee Maharaja Ganga Singh Ji Trust, Bikaner, Managing Trustee Jaipur Virasat Foundation, visiting faculty at School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi, adjunct faculty, Ahmedabad University, and Vice President, ICOMOS, India, a former member of India's National Monuments Authority and of the Central Advisory Board for Archaeology, Government of India. She's a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland and a distinguished international academician of Minnesota University. She's held various academic posts and serves on several governing boards, committees, and councils. A prolific author herself, she's written and edited several books such as History of Rajasthan, Prince, Patriot, Parliamentarian, a biography of Dr. Karni Singh, Maharaja of Bikaner, and Maharana Pratap, the Invincible Warrior. She's also written over 75 papers and articles. We welcome our experts and we request you to begin the session.
Thank you. And very good morning to all our audience here. In fact, I've been looking forward to conversation with Professor Shonaleeka Kaul for a long time. आपने बहुत सारी जगहों का नाम दिया where she's spoken nationally, internationally, but that includes the Bhopal Literature Festival. So welcome back. You last spoke pre-19, pre-COVID. So, and you spoke on the Kashmir then, and you're speaking on Kashmir now. So, ninth book on various topics that center around ancient India. But ancient India doesn't stop at a certain point. So, everything carries on. And this time round, your publisher is Vitasta. So, more links to Kashmir. So, without my going in for too many more of these, I would suggest I give you the mic for a minute before you go on to your thing there. And because I know you want to. Yes, it is working. So the leading question: are we going to have a new book here next year?
Yes, certainly. Why not? It's already out. So I look forward to that. Thank you so much, Reema ji. It's such a pleasure to be here with you again and to be at Bhopal, one of the leading literature fests. Today we have fests are mushrooming all over the country, but I think Bhopal has shown the way in important senses. So it's a great pleasure to be back here.
And usually it used to happen in the past, doesn't happen now. But there were certain subjects. If you said you were doing, I don't know, even maybe archaeology, people would say, "Ha, very interesting, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro," and then not know what to say. But when you say something like she's a professor of Sanskrit, the eyes will glaze over to one level if you don't know enough Sanskrit, and then they will glow with joy if you do know Sanskrit. So you're in that in between land. But you managed to get your students interested, and you have what? How many PhD students at present?
Oh, all the time, too many. But I think that's not entirely correct about Sanskrit. It's a function of our education system, really, that has projected perhaps some subjects, and Sanskrit is not the only one, but also history as something that is quite far removed from our daily sensibilities, our concerns, what can excite us. These come across sometimes as boring or heavy. And everything lies on how you actually do these subjects in your research, in your teaching, and also today what we'll be speaking about. This book is in fact meant specifically, it's based on very detailed historical research, but it's meant specifically for the lay reader, for the non-specialist reader. So I do hope all of you will get your hands on it. And there are 17 essays in it covering a very wide range of themes. And I hope to introduce some of them to you in just a moment.
So I'm not going to stand between the introduction. Kashmir has enough lakes for us to keep having either putting our finger into or jump into. Let's jump into the past and bring it to the present. Or yours.
So, namaskar again, and it's such a pleasure to be speaking today on something that I think concerns all of us very closely, and I'll show you soon why. Bharat. The Indian constitution famously begins with the words, India that is Bharat. The title of my book, then, Bharat Before the British, is not only for alliterative effect, but a nod to the reclamation of selfhood that our independence from British rule in 1947 symbolized. But did independence accomplish truly a reclamation of selfhood intellectually? My book addresses a number of fundamental questions regarding the history of early India that have remained obfuscated and mired in controversies, veiling India's historical truths. So I hope my book actually puts out for the genuinely interested reader who is invested in knowing authentically about our past and about our origins and about our identity. I hope this book will give them a number of cutting edge yet clear headed answers to these questions. There are also profuse illustrations in the book for those of you who are attracted to the visual medium. Now, what are these questions that the book talks about? I'm giving you just a sprinkling. As I said, there are 17 essays in the book, but roughly the following. How far back does the idea of Bharat, that is India, go? Did the British bring India into existence, as you keep hearing from time to time? Or is she, in fact, an ancient nation? What does the evidence tell us beyond the rhetoric? Was Kashmir historically unique, as again we keep hearing, and isolated from the rest of India? Or was she thoroughly connected with it and with its far corners? These are what I call the forgotten histories of Kashmir, and there are as many as 4 essays in Bharat Before the British dedicated to unraveling these forgotten histories. Is myth the antithesis of history, meant to be dismissed and disowned by the modern historian and reader alike? Or is myth a historical mode in its own right and the self expression of historical communities? So, one of the essays goes deeply into the methodology for reclaiming Indic myth in ways that are very rigorous and yet sensitive to what the communities were trying to pass on and transmit by way of myth. Then, what is the antiquity of Krishna worship at Mathura? What does the evidence tell us? So, the association of Krishna with Mathura, but historically, what do we get? Similarly, how did Shakti veneration shape the identity of a people and their land? On a different plane, is there only one way of timekeeping? Or did pre modern India host multiple temporal visions and worldviews that had been suppressed by an unequal world order? So I argue, actually, in fact, there's an entire book I've done on that called Retelling Time: Alternative Temporalities from Pre-Modern South Asia, questioning essentially the hegemony of Western academia over how even we perceive our own ways of knowing. Then, did ancient Indians write history? Another one of those lingering, persistent controversies. Was there an Indic vision of the discipline as different from modern Western and indeed modern global notions today? So, again, this hegemonic notion of what history is as a discipline, did pre modern India subscribe to that? Or did it actually offer an alternate, more cohesive and holistic and humanistic notion of what history is? So I clearly argue that it did. Then, was Sanskrit actually an elitist language, the way it is accused of being? Or did it have public reach and relevance? Clearly, I argue that it had extensive public relevance. Did it speak only for the rich and the powerful, as we are often told? Or did it also recover the voices of marginalized others, as they are called, including non human animals? So there's an essay on animal history in early India in this book as well. Then, what was the purpose of architecture in ancient India? And could it be an instrument of liberation, moksha? So there is an essay on Advaita as architecture. And we didn't even know it, that when we enter the temple, for example, we are actually being propelled willy nilly into an experience of moksha. And the essay shows you how. On the other hand, so you have moksha, but on the other hand, what was the ancient idea of erotics or kama? And how did that relate to society? How did it feel, smell, sound, touch, appear to live in an ancient Indian city? Does Sanskrit poetry contain merely stereotyped and idealized depictions of ancient times? Or have we been simply reading it wrong? What were the overarching goals of Indic knowledge systems, and how far have we come away from them today? In engaging these varied issues, in correcting misplaced perspectives, and in offering culture sensitive methods with which to work through our texts and traditions, Bharat Before the British invites us to rethink our understanding of both India and Indology. It challenges, in particular, the hold on history of colonial approaches on the one hand and political ideologies on the other. These have taken us considerably away from, far from, developing a robust emic, that is, indigenous understanding of our nation, our thought, our practices and patterns of belief and behavior. The diverse essays in this book penned over the years, incidentally, and bringing together history, literature, philosophy, anthropology, and art, reclaim such an understanding that does justice to our historical sources on their own terms rather than compromise them in the service of politics of one kind or another. Fittingly, perhaps then, this book also discusses the state of Indian history today and how we may ameliorate the stasis in the field and its disconnect with the masses. So that's why this book is written, especially in language that is very accessible and yet, as I said, thoroughly rigorous and referential. So all the historical dating, the details of the sources from which we are getting the arguments I make, the book is completely based on primary source material. So it's your go to if you want to know exactly where these references are in the original text rather than in what this historian or the other said. Let me give you a sneak peek into the leading essay of this book, not only to whet your appetite, but because it fundamentally concerns all of us, our collective sense of self as Indians. What is this leading essay? That is what the book is titled on. And it concerns the question, how old is the idea of India? How far back do we go as a people? Now, this is perhaps the most natural curiosity that any culture can have. Yet, as many of you must know, even 78 years into independence, there is still confusion and some kind of contrived debate about this question. Because many actually argue that it is the British that somehow hammered us into shape, unified a very diverse and uh, uh, pulling in different directions bunch of people and regions, and thereby brought India into existence. But what does history say? Now, no doubt this is what the British wanted us to believe. For instance, in 1880, Sir John Strachey, who was British administrator who trained the Imperial Civil Services of India then, he would begin his lectures to the British Indian bureaucrats with the following words, quote, "The first and most important thing to learn about India is that there is not and never was an India," unquote. That the colonial state prided itself in this divisive and uninformed disinformation about the land that it was conquering is not surprising. But what is surprising is that even today, 200 years later, many Indians, both scholars and commoners alike, in fact, celebrities, continue to buy into this misconception. Now, ladies and gentlemen, a nation, as different from a nation state, is first and foremost a notion. It is an idea. It is the jointly held sense of belonging to a common territorial and cultural entity that a people name and assert. It is a community of emotion, of belief, and of praxis, that is, of practices. And just one look at the master texts of Indic civilization will show you again and again, over 2,500 years, this very notion of a felt community and a common bounded entity. This very readily recognizable idea of Bharat attested with astonishing continuity and clarity from 2.5 millennia ago. I'll just tell you what I mean. What is also remarkable is that this idea, this incredibly continuous idea, embraced both India's spatial unity as well as her incredible diversity. So there's an acknowledgement in early India of India's thriving diversity. So unity in diversity is a slogan you've all heard of and associated with the freedom movement. But it is not an invention of the freedom movement in the 1940s. It is, in fact, a very ancient Indian thought. And it is high time that we acknowledge this remarkable phenomenon and go into details. So let me just very quickly give you a few of these stunning examples of a civilization's self awareness. The earliest text to define India, Bharatvarsha, broadly yet resonantly as the land between the Himalayas and the sea, is the very ancient Mahabharata, conservatively dated by historians to 5th century BCE. Many would disagree and say it is much older than that. The Bhishma Parva of the Mahabharata, its 10th chapter, details, not in a passing reference, not in a poetic flourish, but in more than 70 verses, a great portrait of the land. So it talks about first the historical geography of India, all the many mountain ranges and rivers of this land running from the north and northwest to the south and from the northeast to the west, including Ganga, Sindhu, Vitasta or Jhelum, Saraswati, Yamuna, Chandrabhaga or Chenab, Gomti, Sarayu, Godavari, Narmada, Mahanadi, and I could go on. But even more comes after that. It then documents the ethnography of the land, namely the Janapadas, that is, the territories occupied by variegated communities or Janas that peopled Bharatvarsha. So, a very invested and a very committed and clear notion of what they're talking about. Now, significantly, the Mahabharata is often given this label of mythology, like the Ramayana. And yet, these communities, these janas being named in a mythological text, are all historically attested people. So we have to question this binary of myth and history that has been around for too long. Who are these historical janas that inhabited Bharatvarsha in the Mahabharata right at the beginning? Starting with, surprise, surprise, Kashmir. So the people of Kashmir, Kashmirah, are the first to be named. And this is very important because this means Kashmir has been a part of the understanding of India from the earliest articulation of that understanding. So there is no India, as it were, without a Kashmir being part of it. So another one of those misconceptions that goes out of the window. Then it talks about Gandhara, Cambodia, and Punjab in the north, to Vidarbha and Malava in central India, and from Kashi, Magad, Odisha, Bengal, Assam in the east, to Dravida, Kerala, Karnataka, Kuntala, which is Telangana today, and Chola in the south. 2,500 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. Those named also included Mlechas and Yavanas on the one hand, broadly translated as outsiders, and what we call tribes or forest dwellers. So Nishadas, Shabaras, Kiratas, and Abhiras. They're all a part of Bharatvarsha in this vision. There is also an explicit reference to all four castes inhabiting Bharatvarsha. So all the Varnas. So what do we find? In the Mahabharat's vision, there is no conflict between the unity and identity of Bharatvarsha and its inherent diversity, which is actually being celebrated in this very inclusive and very robust idea of a nation. Bharatvarsha emerges here in this earliest reference as a singularity that subsumes rather than erases the many. So we have been very comfortable. Let not the world teach us about multiculturalism. We have actually been very comfortable with this notion from the very beginning. So the Mahabharata is this outstanding testimony, but that's not all. There are more than a dozen that I talk about in the book. Very quickly, in the 4th century BCE, the Greek ambassador to India, Megasthenes, in his book Indica, also named the land of the Indoi as bounded by the sea to the east, west, and south, by Mount Hamados, abode of snow to the north, where he is clear that it was separated from Central Asia or Scythia, so no confusion there, and bounded by the Indus to the west, is what Megasthenes tells you. He adds for good measure, tantalizingly, quote, India, being of enormous size, is peopled by races numerous and diverse, of which not even one was originally of foreign descent, but all were indigenous. Unquote. A loaded statement if you think about contemporary debates on identity and migration and so on. Then Ptolemy, you might have heard of him. He's the 2nd century famed geographer from the Roman Empire. He claimed in similar fashion that India was bounded by the ocean and the snowy mountains, but he also fascinatingly spoke of an India that went east of the mouth of the Ganga right up to China, is how he puts it. So, my read of this is that perhaps this is including what we today call the Northeast and certainly also the Bangladesh. He also cited the Hindu Kush as the western boundary of India. This is all very instructive. Now, what about the south? In the far south, at about the same time, Tamil Sangam texts like the Patirapattu and the later Shilabadikaram in the 5th century were also invoking the same geographic imagery between the snowy Himalayas and Cape Kumari, Kanyakumari, Cape Comorin in the oceanic south. At the same time, in the 5th century, the Vishnu Mahapuran mapped not just Bharat's geographic but also ethnic and cultural boundaries thus. Now, this is important to note. Many people say, all right, so India existed as a geography, so what? So a hell of a lot, because geography is demography. But more than that, these sources are also cognizant of defining India as a cultural and ethnic phenomenon. So, what does the Vishnu Puran say? उत्तरं यत् समुद्रस्य हिमाद्रैश्चैव दक्षिणं वर्षं तद् भारतं नाम भारती यत्र सन्ततिः. So the children of whom, the children of which land are Bharati. I don't need to tell you, that is exactly what we call ourselves today, 1500 years later. It goes on to say, Yojananam Navasahasram tu Dvipo Ayam Dakshinottarat Purve Kirata Yasyante Paschime Yavanaha Sthitaha. Very quick translation. The country north of the sea and south of the Himalayas is Bharata, and her children are Bharati. So you see, notion that is being named and asserted. 9,000 yojanas from north to south. It has Kiratas in the east and Yavanas in the west. Who are the Kiratas? Understood to refer to the denizens of Assam and the eastern Himalayas, while the Yavanas refer to those settled in Greater Punjab. So, on view is an explicit and inclusive self understanding of the land as a unity through her plurality. This would further resonate with Xuanzang, the Chinese Buddhist pilgrim's testimony in the 7th century. Now, Zhang traveled all over India and left a detailed account of the land called the Ki. I hope you can still hear me. I don't know if the mics are working. They are. Now, what does Xuanzang say? He says that standing at a place called Langham, now ancient Nagarahara. Now, this is near Jalalabad in Afghanistan today. Okay? So just west of the Khyber Pass, so west of the Hindu Kush. Swansang, 7th century, is standing west of the Hindu Kush, and he says that he felt he stood at the gateway to a country called Indu. So Swansang's name for India is Indu. And he described Indu again in classical terms as bounded by the snowy mountains and the sea, extending to an area of 90,000 li, that's Chinese mile, and inhabited by 70 different kingdoms. So, see again, no conflict seen between multiplicity of kingdoms and the larger country. He tells you the meaning of the name Indu, calling it the Sanskrit word for moon, which is correct. And he says, why? Why is India called the moon? Because he says that the country was luminous from the collective radiance of its sages, of its saints. He also mentions other older names for India, but he says Indians preferred the name Hindu the most. What that is telling you is from the 7th century that Indians, there was such a thing as Indians who actually opted for a certain name for themselves and liked the name Hindu. So here is a self image that you're getting. This is not just being ascribed by a foreigner. Now, explicitness and inclusivity in the idea of India are found articulated again in the 6th century Brihat Sangahita of Varaha Mihir, which again devotes 20 verses to exhaustively enumerating the many regions. Again, starting from Kashmir and Peshawar in the north, up to the Dravidas, Kerala and Karnataka in the south, Assam, Odisha and Bengal in the east, and Saurashtra in the west. The sheer detail, ladies and gentlemen, of this idea of Bharat, not today, but 1500 years ago, is mind boggling and speaks to an abundant self awareness of both diversity and what I call a common unified sphere of cultural circulation. Now, very quickly, perhaps there is no better illustration of this idea of Bharat as one but many, or as many but one, than who do you think? The stellar Adi Shankaracharya, right? The seer intellectual who in the 8th century established the supremacy of Vedant Advait. What is Advait but unified consciousness beyond multiplicity and form? Now, why do I say Shankara actually epitomizes this identity of India? Because starting from his hometown in Kaladi in Kerala, it doesn't get further south than that, right? Shankara is said to have undertaken a famous Digvijaya, which is a tour of philosophical conquest of the entire land, intensely debating and defeating the varied local scholarship from Papalikas and Pashupatas to Mimamsakas, Vaishnavas, Shaktas, Jainas, Bodhas, and so on. But where? Where is the question? What was his route? First, he goes to Tamil Nadu, then Andhra, Vidarbha, and these are named in contemporary sources. This is not being reconstructed today. Andhra, Vidarbha, Karnataka, Gujarat, onwards to Ujjaini, Madhya Pradesh, Pahalika, which is Bactria, Churasen, that is Mathura, Daradas, even, that is Gilgit and Baltistan, Kurupanchal, Punjab and Haryana, Kedarnath, Badrinath, which we know about, and then Kamarupa, Assam, Border, Bengal, and Koshala, or Uttar Pradesh, modern Uttar Pradesh. But where do you think he culminates his Digvijaya? The fitting culmination of these Advaitic travels was none other than Kashmir, in the renowned center of all learning, Sharda Peeth. The 13th century text Shankara Digvijaya says, in all the world, Jambudvipa is best. In Jambudvipa, Bharata. And in Bharata, Kashmir is the best because there resides Ma Sharada. Unquote. Indeed, till today, I am told prayers in Tamil Nadu begin with the invocation Sharda Devi Kashmir Purvasuni Namastute. What astounding connectivity between the far north and the far south of India. And the Shankaracharya temple at Srinagar, I don't know how many of you have visited that very ancient temple. It still stands witness to this incredible centrality of the far north of India to the imagination of the far south, and vice versa. Because local memory in Kashmir is still remembering and commemorating this man from Kerala. While that man from Kerala chose self consciously to go none other than to the very north of this land. And we say there was no notion of a Bharat in ancient times. I'm not even speaking of the four Pithas, the Chaturamanaya Pithas that Shankara founded in the four corners of the country. In the 11th century, the Arab traveler Al Biruni, in his Kitabul Hind, on the one hand, and Jaina cosmological literature on the other from the same period, are speaking of a Hind. So the new name, same place, Hind. And the Jainas speak of Bharata Khanda. 14th century Indo Persian poet Amir Khusro, in his Nau Sipir, resoundingly speaks of this Hind as his Vatan or nation. So you have a word for the nation much before Amir Khusro, of course. You have the term Rashtra first occurring in the Rigvedic period. Of course, different connotations. But throughout the Mahabharata, the Manusmriti, Arthashastra, everybody is talking of that term. So the Vatan. So what are you getting from the 5th century BCE to the 5th century CE, right down to the 14th century CE? You have a thriving, throbbing idea of India or Bharat. He cites Hind's dozen languages, which he calls Hindavi, to include, he says, Sanskrit first of all. And he calls Sanskrit the pearl of all pearls. So here is a 14th century estimation of this language that many of us have got really cut off from today. And perhaps it is time to go back to it. Then, what does he enumerate after that? Kashmiri. So Kashmiri is enumerated as a Hindavi language, as an Indic language in the 14th century. Sindhi, Punjabi, Bengali, Gujarati, Kannada, and Tamil, all Hindavi languages, according to 14th century Amir Khusro. His understanding of Hind then was the same as the area covered by these languages. He tells you more about Hind. He says Hind was Firdaus, or paradise on earth, and far superior to other countries. Unashamedly, he says that, quote unquote. No being politically correct and concerns and fears of jingoism and cultural chauvinism and so on for him. He's very clear. And remember, he's the son of a Turkish settler from Uzbekistan. And yet he's so clear about the land he has settled in. He says India's intellectual wealth is incomparable, and the world's scholars come to India to gain knowledge, whereas Indians had no need to go to the world for the same. He goes on to name all the knowledge systems that thrived in Hind and affirms that India invented the numerals. So, another one of those debates that should be shunned once and for all. Ironically, these numerals are called Arabic numerals today. So, you see how far we can go from away from history and away from historical truths. He also says that India invented the zero, again, something that has lately been attempted to be hijacked. And of course, the game of chess or shatranj. He says a lot more, but I want to quote just a few lines from Amir Khusro. He says,
And maybe after
quote,
that, we open it for questions. So you might want to wind up.
about to finish. He quotes, there cannot be a greater teacher than the way of life of the people here. It is the gift of the Almighty, this cultural environment, very rare in other countries. If perchance any Iranian, Greek, or Arab comes by, he will not lack for anything because they will treat him as their own. Unquote. What a stellar portrait of the soul of Bharat. There are many other examples. 16th century Abul Fazl is talking of Hindustan. And again, a very clear notion of where it extends, what it is not, what it is clearly not, and that is Turan, Iran, and China. And he says Kabul and Kandahar are the twin gates of Hindustan, and you must guard these to have peace from what he calls the alien raiders. He also praises Indians as God fearing, just, and generous. Contemporary Tibetans, Rimaji, and this is the last evidence I'm presenting. There's a lot more in the book. Like Lama Taranath in the 15th century, in his History of Buddhism, also has a name for India. They called India Ragyar or Fagzul, that is vast land and noble country, the source country of their Buddhist masters who came from Kashmir, Peshawar, Andhra, Kanchi, Saurashtra, and Bengal. So clearly, the Greeks, the Chinese, the Tibetans, they all knew exactly what India was. And yet we have been in denial. Staggering evidence, I think you will agree, ladies and gentlemen, of astonishing convergences in the knowledge of what India or Bharat was long before the British. Hence the lead title of my book. Whether known as Bharatvarsha, Hindu, Hind, Indoy, Ragyar, Fagzul, or Hindustan, they knew that they were speaking of the same land. Naturally, not always coterminous with modern day or present day boundaries. No one is claiming that. But the fact that a great deal was held in common in the idea of Bharat across the centuries by Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, and Jains, by residents as well as foreign travelers, by pilgrims, poets, and chroniclers, should once and for all settle the modern debate that attempts to deny antiquity and continuity to the idea of Bharat. For this and many more decisive insights into the ancient, living, throbbing civilization called India, please read Bharat Before the British. I will take only a minute more to show you 3 or 4 images that might interest you. Now, that is a map carried in the book made by me representing many, not all, but many of the janas that the Mahabharat names as a part of Bharatvarsha. So here is a spatial representation. You can see it is a pan-Indic coverage, 5th century BCE at least. And they have a very clear notion of the extent of Bharatvarsha. Next, please. It is not only the text, I should add. I have talked today only about the text. I am a text specialist, but the book details a large number of other sources, including archaeological and inscriptional ones. So, a very early inscription from India that refers to Bharat Varsha in Prakrit as Bharat Vasa is the Kalinga inscription, the Hathi Gumfa inscription of King Kharavel, 1st century BCE, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. So, again, very early, right? And Bharatvarsha is not just a term of reference, but it is an aspiration in this inscription. That Kalinga king says he wants to conquer all of Bharatvarsha, and so on. Next, please. That is, again, the plotting of only a few places in Shankara's Digvijaya, and that is the epic Shankaracharya temple in Srinagar, symbolizing perhaps everything that I've been talking about today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shonaleeka. You might want to stay there, I don't know, for the questions. But I can clearly see we need at least 16 more lectures to cover the chapters, but maybe 17. But some of the issues that you raised will definitely have questions coming. Some of the ones you didn't get round to talking about are there. What's fascinating is that these essays were written at different points in time, but they come together almost in a chronological, not in that time, sense of that timeline, but conceptually, logically, they come together. And you take us from Bharat, Dilha Hindustani, through to what Kashmir and the landscape of Kashmir is all about. And then the Shakti Peeths, and of course, religion, because the Sharada Peeth, the Sarvagyan,
Sarvagya yes,
which is part of India. At this point, it's on the line of control, just beyond the line of control.
beyond, yes.
But it is in the minds of everyone, it is part of the ancient land we are talking about.
In fact, I might add that it's not just Shankara, but the 12th century Rajatarangani also talks of the Sharda Peeth, pilgrims coming to the Sharda Peeth in the 8th century from as far as Bengal, so hundreds of miles away. And then in the 11th century, Al-Biruni is also going out of his way to enumerate Sharda Peeth as among the top 3 shrines of entire Hind. So that says something, doesn't it?
Well, when you look at how pilgrimage routes work, it is in the mind. You want to go to all the places that you hear about, that you heard talked about, that are part of the cognition. And you bring that together beautifully by then moving from, you're bringing in religion, you're bringing in practices.
Also, Islam in Kashmir in the 15th century.
Exactly. But before you get, or around the same time, uh, the concept of Shaivism, again, the Advait part,
That's right.
the poet saint, all of that, you come to, as I said, you move forward, you bring in a 15th century manuscript that is kind of bridging the ancient world of old Kashmir and the Kashmir that is coming into being with the influence of Islam there.
I'm so glad you highlighted that because this is a fascinating text called the Katha Kautukam. It is in Sanskrit, it is by Pandit Srivara. But what is it? It is actually a reworking of, not a mere translation, no. It's a reworking of an Persian Masnavi called Yusuf Azulekha, composed just a few couple of decades before Srivara. So, 15th century Kashmir, Islamization has begun, and yet here is this Pandit Srivara who's actually picking up the use of Azulekha to render it into Sanskrit. Now that's common enough phenomenon, but what is remarkable is the what he undertakes, the prodigiousness of what he undertakes. So Yusuf Azulekha talks of Allah, and Srivara converts that to Shiva. So the cultural confidence that you see displayed in 15th century Kashmir. And additionally, what this is a pointer to is how Kashmir Shaivism, so the Kashmir Shaiv notion of Parama Shiva is a trans-sectarian one. It is not the Saguna Shiva alone, it is the Nirguna Shiva. It is consciousness in itself, pure consciousness. And this then becomes the platform that actually allows a homegrown Sufism. So we are not talking about the imposed from the top, Sharia heavy, Persian state centric notion of Islam in Kashmir, which also was introduced in Kashmir with, the sources tell us, a great deal of violence. There's no denying that. And Srivara himself talks about that in the book. So does Jonaraj, who is a contemporary historian of that time. You must all read these works. But yet there also grows a homegrown notion of Kashmir Sufism called Rishiism. So the continuity is with the preceding culture and this Rishiism. Nund Rishi or Sheikh Nuruddin is the high point of this Rishi school. And who does he seek his inspiration from, his learning from? Who does he call the avatar, our avatar? None other than the yogini, the Shaiva yogini Lalleshwari. So this is what is really happening in 15th century Kashmir at this cusp. Of course, later things change. We see that state sponsored Islam actually taking over. So, a more orthodox sense of Islam actually taking over and completely absorbing and appropriating this Rishiism. But at that historical moment, this text speaks to this very beautiful amalgam, as it were.
I'm going to say your text speaks, but let others explore your text. I can see hand way back there, so it's all right with you. Yes, please. And do identify yourself, sir.
Yeah, I am into literature, but I have interest in history also. My name is Mohan Gehani. Today, Sindh is a part of Pakistan. That's a different matter. I had written a small introduction to history of Sindh, and I was assigned to translate into my language the history of ancient India by a National Translation Mission, and I had translated that ancient India's history also. I have only two questions rather. do you dismiss the concept of India because you are emphasizing only Bharat? Another question,
Am I, sir?
another question,
Am I, sir?
just a minute. Another question. Aren't you trying to give a counter hegemonic narrative of history which with which you disagree as a colonial narrative? These are two questions. And as far as combining Hindu and Hinduism, because Hindu is a Persian concept, Persian identity given to us through Persians. And India is through Greeks when Alexander came here. So India, as well as Hindu or Hindustan, they are not recent identities that have been given after arrival of the British or Europeans.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
So
May
yeah,
I now answer your questions? That's exactly what this essay is
yeah.
tracing for you. This is not a modern phenomenon. This is not as late as the mid 20th century phenomenon, etc. It's a 2,500 year phenomenon. You said I'm emphasizing only Bharat. Am I dismissing India? Not at all. My whole point is that this India in pre modernity was known by a variety of names from a variety of actors, social actors, and observers coming from all kinds of contexts and backgrounds across time. But somehow they were all holding in common what that understanding of India was. So it is time to actually acknowledge that solid body of evidence that this notion is clear, whatever the nomenclature. And the nomenclature is an accumulative one. It is not as if, say, when Hind happens, Bharat disappears, or when Hindustan or Indoy is named, Hind disappears. It doesn't. These all are names that have been historically accrued and continue to denote our identity. You said, am I providing a counter hegemonic narrative? Of course, this is countering the hegemony of a complete misconception that the British brought India into existence. We are the important point is to distinguish nation from nation state. We are not talking of a nation state, which no doubt came into being in 1947, or if you like, under the British Empire. But what about the nation? It is so much older. And what I am challenging is an idea of history that is predicated on the centrality of change only. I'm saying that's not good enough, a notion of history, when you're studying an ancient, continuous living civilization like India. Continuities have to be factored into our understanding of ourselves and our self identity. Change is not all there is. And the British bring a great deal of change and disjuncture historically. But that doesn't affect actually the continuity of our self knowledge. And we need to acknowledge that.
Thank you. There are two hands back there. Who's got the mic?
I've got the mic.
Right.
Ma'am, one very simple question.
Where are
Uh,
you, sir?
Here I am. Yeah. So, you mentioned that the concept of Bharat came around 500 BC at the time of Mahabharata, but almost, 200 years hence, during the time of Chandragupta, and then, maybe 100 years after Ashok, there was a word used very often that was Jambudip. So was Jambudip and Bharat, are they the same conceptually or there is some different? Because that time the mention used to be of Jambudip, not Bharat.
There is an occasional, there is one Ashokan edict that refers to Jambudvipa. Now, what is Jambudvipa? That historians today deem that because Bharat is understood as a subsection, subunit of Jambudvipa, and then within Bharat come other regional subsections. So they say Jambudvipa must be a reference to broadly what we today know as South Asia. So Jambudvipa is not India, is not Bharat. Let's put it like that to not confuse issues. Jambudvipa is not Bharat. It is a larger entity than Bharat, and Bharat is deemed to be a geographical subsection. The Purans are replete with this kind of cultural geography, and they give infinite detail. So, if nothing else, we have to give credit for the 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 care with which these notions and these outlines were being laid down 2000 years ago of geography, both Indic and external.
There was a hand right next to you or near you, and then one in the front.
Hello.
Ji boliye, we can hear you.
Yeah, myself R.K. चौबे. कश्मीर के ऊपर जो बहुत सारी बातें अभी मैम ने भी बताई और आपने भी क्वेश्चन किया, मैं जो पढ़ रहा था वो 3 शब्दों में कश्मीर को अगर हम समझाएं कि वो हमारा हिस्सा है या नहीं है, वाणी, सरस्वती और शारदा। अगर इन 3 की यात्रा हम करते हैं, वाणी शब्दों की यात्रा है, सरस्वती ज्ञान है और शारदा व्हिच इज आइडेंटिफाई एरिया। तो वो मैं अपनी बात बस इतना ही कहना चाहता हूँ कि इट इज ए जर्नी। कश्मीर जो है इट इज ए जर्नी, वाणी, सरस्वती एंड शारदा। थैंक यू।
Thank you. Thank you. Incidentally, in ancient times, Kashmir was also known as Sharda Desh. But again, for more reasons than only geographical, it is not only because the Sharda Peeth was there, but also because Sharda herself stands for Shakti Saraswati. So Kashmir is deeply Shaiva Shakt, but additionally seen as the center of all learning. Hence Sharda Desham. So that preeminent claim of Kashmir to intellectual superiority across the entire subcontinent is again something many histories completely miss. Kashmir just doesn't figure. Thank you. Thank you. Kashmir just doesn't figure in our textbooks. Correct me if I'm wrong, students. We will hear of the Neolithic, Burza home, Gufkaral, New Stone Age, and next suddenly we might have a Rajtarangani thrown in 12th century CE, and the story ends. Whereas Kashmir, this completely belies the centrality of Kashmir to Indic civilization for over a millennium and a half. And I've written about this in my book, The Making of Early Kashmir Landscape and Identity in the Rajtarangani, Oxford University Press 2018. Please read it. Bharat Before
Discussed
the
here,
British. Yes.
and it's on YouTube.
Yes, lots of videos. And Bharat Before the British actually brings for you succinctly this entire massive body of evidence, including, may I add, migrations. Who are the people of Kashmir? I'm a Kashmiri myself. I was amazed to discover that, contrary to what we have been conditioned to believe about Kashmir, you have had migrations over these 2000 years from different corners of India, people going and settling in Kashmir. So, Kashmir is as Indic as it gets. And you have Kashmiris migrating out from Kashmir and settling in other parts of the country, including as far south as Chidambaram, where inscriptional references across at least 4 different sites in the south are talking of as early as 12th century and 15th century original residents of Kashmir Desha now settled in the south, holding high office and owning land. This is Kashmir for you, the most open, plural, and cosmopolitan land, not a closed, unique, and insular one.
Your question. Question there.
Uh, can I put a thing, ma'am? You mentioned about Saraswati and Sharda. You would perhaps be aware that the Sharda and Saraswati extended beyond Kashmir, geographical Kashmir as it exists today. In bulk in Afghanistan, northwest Afghanistan, rising from the Pamirs there in the Hindu Kush Mountains, is the Saraswati River, the ancient name of the river that is called Oxus today. It starts from near Balk in northwest Afghanistan. And you know where it drains? In the Caspian Sea. And on the east coast of the Caspian Sea, and on the west coast of the Caspian Sea, at Baku in Azerbaijan, is an ancient Shiva temple which is still worshipped. And in the entrance to it is written Om Namah Ganesh. So the concept of Bharat, I would say, actually in the ancient times extended, and yesterday's lesson also on one of the sessions mentioned this, actually goes far beyond the geographical boundaries of Kashmir and even Afghanistan.
So
Thank
that,
you, sir, for
thank
that.
you, thank
But I'm
you.
going to, Shonalika, before you answer that, I'm going to let you have your turn at the mic, and then you can do the sum up.
Can we get her a
Because
mic,
we need to
please?
Please,
give time to the next
I,
session.
I have a
This
question.
can go on forever.
Ah,
It's
But
always delightful. Mic?
one question for
No,
answer.
I know you'll have more questions. We can discuss them. So, Professor Shonalika Kaul will be signing her books in the authors' lounge, not the authors, in the signing area. And you can all talk to her to your heart's content afterwards. But we need to give मंच जो है वो समय से चलेगा.
But I will like her to talk to audience about this.
Sorry.
That what infused
She will answer
her
you.
to have these insights. I
Right.
want to hear that.
Fine.
So
We have a time
compelling.
thing here. Let the lady with the mic have her question.
ma'am, we are running over time,
We are
please.
running out
And
of time.
one
And I
last
have the
question
mic.
quickly. Yes.
Question, please.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, history is not boring. I myself a student of history. My simple question is, जब आप इस बुक पे काम कर रही थी, आपने ट्रैवल किया होगा नॉर्थ, साउथ, ईस्ट, वेस्ट, एवरीवेयर. तो कंपैरेटिवली जब आप इंटरेक्ट कर रही हैं एक साउथ के पर्सन से और एक इंटरेक्शन हो रहा है आपका कश्मीर में किसी व्यक्ति से, तो उस जर्नी के बारे में अगर आप थोड़ा हाईलाइट करें कि आपके क्या अपने एक्सपीरियंस रहे थे कि एक वायलेंस वाला एरिया है कश्मीर, वहां आप जाके रिसर्च कर रही हैं और कंपैरेटिवली आप साउथ में या नॉर्थ ईस्ट में रिसर्च कर रही हैं, अगर वो कुछ पॉइंट्स आप हाईलाइट करें तो ज़्यादा अच्छा होगा.
आपका क्वेश्चन इंटरेस्टिंग है, लेकिन आई मे नॉट हैव द आंसर फॉर दैट बिकॉज व्हेन यू आर वर्किंग ऑन एंशिएंट इंडिया you're not actually going and speaking to contemporary Indians, because this is not an ethnographic survey. We are not talking of what you believe today. We are talking about what was the case for the first 2000 years of Indian history, for instance. I also don't want to comment on what's happening in Kashmir, because again, let history do the talking. Let history intervene and correct. So, a lot of this book is, ladies and gentlemen, a historical corrective. It's a corrective both to the history we have been taught, and it is a corrective to absolutely fallacious narratives that have been propagated politically from both within and outside the country. So, part of the reason for this book is that Indians should know their history authentically. And I'm happy to report that when my first book on Kashmir came out and when this book came out, I have had random young people from the valley search me out on social media, drop me messages in DM saying, "Thank you, ma'am. I read your book. We didn't know this is our history." So I think we are getting there.
Thank you for that. I know the session can go on, and it will, but outside, because अब जिनकी बारी है उनको मंच देना स्वाभाविक भी है और सही भी है. I'm going to let you do your bit and conclude.
Thank
But
you, Rima ji.
Shonalika, thank you. Again, it's been a pleasure to talk to you at the Bhopal Literature Festival. Let's hope we do it again, this time with another book. अब आपके लिए बारी.
Ji. I think this session will definitely force us to rethink our traditional understanding of ancient civilization called India. Thank you for this very engaging session, Professor Kaul and Dr. Hooja. And I would now request Brigadier Sanjay Agarwal to felicitate our experts, our authors.
And thank our wonderful audience. आप अभी भी इतने engaged हैं कि अभी भी सवाल पूछना चाह रहे हैं.
तो मेरी किताब का मकसद फिर पूरा हुआ.
जी, बिल्कुल.
The whole point was just this. Thank
Let
you
us
so much.
show
Thank
that
you.
with a round of applause. Brigadier Agarwal presenting the BLF Memento 2025 to Professor Shonaleeka Kaul and Dr. Rima Hooja.
No, you stay where you are.
The memento is an artwork created by Padma Shri Bhil artist Bhuri Baiji, which depicts the connection between nature, earth, the human being, and the environment.
Mesmerizing, fact-filled, stimulating. Thank you.
बहुत बढ़िया.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next session is the Middle East in Crisis, where Lieutenant General Raj Shukla will be in conversation with Mr. M.J. Akbar. I would request our experts to grace the stage. With a fragile ceasefire in place, the new US president instructing the US military to release a hold on the supply of 2,000-pound bombs to Israel, the Palestinians, numerous thousands of Palestinians returning home to a devastated Gaza, the exchange of hostages and Palestinian prisoners, the Middle East crisis changes by the hour. To discuss the same, we are joined by Lieutenant General Raj Shukla and Mr. M.J. Akbar. Lieutenant General Shukla, Param Vishish Seva Medal, Yudh Seva Medal, Sena Medal, is a former army commander with over 4 decades of distinguished service in the Indian Army across a wide range of operational, ideational, and training assignments. General Shukla has made noteworthy contributions to the development of India's strategic military futures, technological innovation, professional military education, capacity building, operational poise, and civil military fusion. A combat aviator and accomplished public speaker, the officer has an abiding interest in strategic military affairs. He's also published more than 70 articles in journals and prominent dailies. He's also lectured and participated in approximately 362 talks, seminars, events in India and all over the world. He's a distinguished fellow at the Center for Land Warfare Studies. And sir, I would request you to introduce Mr. Akbar. Thank you.
Thank you. So, friends, ladies and gentlemen, Namaskar, Jai Hind. Welcome to the 7th Knowledge Kumbh Festival and to this conversation on West Asia in crisis.